Hi there. This is not a handheld microphone, and I feel like I'm strangling a squid. Anyways, I recently went on vacation, not something I commonly do, like ever, and certainly not the kinds of vacations where you just get to lay around and have free time. Whenever I had vacation growing up, we would be visiting my many, many, many Dutch cousins and then, do a lot of church tours or whatever. So it was kind of an interesting new experience in terms of getting to just lay around in a very nice, warm environment, by the pool side, very fancy. They had unlimited alcohol, very nice. And yeah, I got a lot of reading done, and specifically, I brought a bunch of books that I thought would be good, and I also made time to prioritize reading books that I thought would be good, or at least much more different than what I would normally cover on my book blog / list channel. So some of them I am actually going to do separate videos on, definitely one or two of them. 3 of them I've specifically written full reviews of, but this video is just sort of going to be a check-in on a wide variety of odd little books I picked up. Some of them are really recognizable, some of them you will have never heard of before, and while the goal was definitely to read good books, it really again was more about reading new and different books. So while a number of these were 5 stars, I loved it, it's nice to read a good book for once in my life, there were some real bad ones mixed in as well. This is just all off the cuff, and I already recorded it once, and then none of the audio recorded. In theory, that means I'll be more concise and proper about my thoughts on each book, but in practice, I don't know. That was yesterday. So, I'm just gonna go through them in the order I read them. I read 10 books, let's just get going, okay? So, first thing I read was Utterly Dark and the Heart of the Wild. And Utterly Dark is fantastic, and Utterly Dark Heart of the Wild is fantastic. It's a middle grade book. I always feel a little bit I don't read a lot of middle grade. Middle grade, of course, is the age group between children's books and young adult books. It means middle grade is in the middle of grades. It's ages about 10 to 13 or so. Yeah, I don't make much practice of reading a lot of it. I don't have kids or know any children in my life, but that doesn't mean they can't be really fun to read, especially as you're an adult rereading them for nostalgic reasons, but also reading new ones can still be really good. We as a society have sort of accepted that a lot of adults read YA, but I feel like people are still a little bit weird if you're ever yeah, I also pick up middle grade sometimes. I don't, again, make a habit of it, but Utterly Dark in the Heart of the Wild is by Reeve, who is my all-time favorite author. I go read more Legends, and also you should be reading more Legends, but also check out Railhead or Larklight, the opposite, cousin of the other one that we all don't like. He's great, and Utterly Dark is just so lovely. It's this series about a girl and sort of old magic. I'm gonna do such a bad way of describing it, but it captures this feeling really well of being a child on the cusp of realizing magic isn't real, when you're 12 or 13 and you still believe in a lot of rituals from childhood, but you also are starting to comprehend that magic's not real and you're never gonna go on a magical adventure like everyone else. This interesting rock that you care about is never gonna turn to a dragon egg, And I think it captures that feeling really well somehow. It makes you just sort of nostalgic for childhood adventures and, again, the feeling of magic being grand and incomprehensible, but also, maybe it's still all out there and around you. Utterly Dark, this is the second Utterly Dark book. The first one is Utterly Dark and the Face of the Deep, which, again, absolutely really, really good. Reeve just has this amazing way of writing his world building. This isn't something with a complex magic system or anything like that. So world building in this case just means the feeling and character of the world around them, which is a small English island, very much in both books inspired by Somerset in England or Dartmoor. Just It's really lovely. It's a really good adventure. This one in particular, the second book, is about fae kind of parallel things. Again, it's way more like old magic, proto-fae, before people understood things like that, but understood the wilderness itself as like a great god who's been long forgotten, and then takes his revenge. It's great. Anyways, that's just me saying I really love this book. I know that most people don't care about it or know about it because it's middle grade, but Philip Reeve really can deliver, okay? Second book that I read was Reaperman, which is a Discworld book. And Discworld is something I've been meaning to read for a very, very long time. I actually joined Tumblr in like 2011 to follow somebody who is doing a Homestuck AU that I was really fond of called Stab Dads. And they posted about this one specific Homestuck thing, and also the Night Watch from Discworld. That was my first exposure. I was a teenager in America, and I could not find Discworld anywhere. I was from a small town, and there were multiple bookstores, multiple secondhand stores, libraries. Nobody had Discworld. So I really wondered about it. I'd heard so many good things, and I never could get my hands on it. And now living in England, it's really common to find Discworld at secondhand bookstores. But I still never really made any time to read it. And now, for, like a couple years, I've lived with my flatmate, and she has all of Discworld. Some people have seen it before, the bookshelf that I stand in front of. I don't think that it starts in like the layer below what's currently visible. Because we share the bookshelves, and she just has every single Discworld book. And I still haven't read it. So it was good to finally pick up Reaperman and like see what it was about. I knew that I would like it and the vibe of Discworld. It's very funny, but it's also like deeply profound in a lot of ways. It really has some of the like extremely hard-hitting, extremely good writing where suddenly it just like sucker punches you with a kind of deep thought that makes you think about life in a way you've never have before. And then it goes on and has a bunch of extremely funny little just like jokes, comedic bits. Discworld is this kind of absurd fantasy, which is very silly. Most of the books are sort of like comedic farces to my understanding, but then again, they are just amazing sometimes, or they'll just hit you with some of the most beautiful stuff you've ever read. And Reaperman especially is not one of the suggested starting places for reading it, but I think it was absolutely perfect for me because it's a story about death, where Death is forced to retire and actually is kind of enthusiastic because he's never had, like, he's told that he has to retire and eventually he's going to basically die when they hire a new Death. And he's actually, at first, extremely excited because he's never had time to spend before. He's a entity that represents death. He's not technically like a person. So he goes and heads to a small village and decides to become a farmer because he's good of a scythe. And so he then faces his own mortality while being death. And, it really becomes a story about, like, what is the meaning of life? What's the meaning of death, What is the relationship of death to life? And on the same, other plot line is the wizards, and I love the wizards so much in Discworld. I like any portrayal of a wizard where they're sort of like newborn baby deer shivering in the, first frost of winter. I love that in a wizard, and especially then when they're also, crotchety old men who suck and are pathetic. That's all I want in a wizard. And the wizards in Discworld are very funny, and they have a major plot line in Reaperman that I wasn't expecting, and it's really, really good. I find that I'm not that good at talking about books that I really like. I don't know if you can tell that. This is one of the reasons that I mostly end up picking books I'm pretty sure I'll dislike, because I find that I'm much better at reviewing them. But this is sort of a mix, reviews, thoughts, whatever the heck, Reaperman, super good. Pick it up. If you haven't read Discworld, I definitely highly suggest checking it out. At this point, I've only read 2 of the series, but I have a lot of, I've heard extremely good things about all of it, okay? Next book that I picked up was Gideon the Ninth, and Gideon the Ninth is one of those extremely, extremely hot books right now, especially on Tumblr. I know all of the spoilers about the series, and I have for a while, so I knew pretty much every story beat of the book as I was going into it, which made for a different experience. And, Gideon the Ninth is very odd, is what I will say, mostly because the characters are all very strong aesthetic ideas. Each character can be like kind of there's a lot of characters in this book, and each one can sort of be quickly summed up with a couple key like visual personality traits. Bam, slam, there you go. So the characters are sort of, you know, neatly wrapped up and ready for presentation. The world and the aesthetic of the world and the, you know, concepts of how the magic and all that stuff works are also all really cool and interesting. There's some unique ideas out there, while also the book is very keen to never explain or even pretend to explain how any of it works. Like, they just are, this book is so adamant on just hand-waving absolutely everything about its magic system and science system and everything system. So yeah, there's a lot of these positives and negatives, and then when we get down to it, we get to the plot, and the plot of Gideon the Ninth is, I hate it. It's so bad. It's really weird because, again, there's some snappy dialogue. I didn't really find it that funny. I thought a lot of the dialogue was very much built to be a Tumblr post, you know, rather than built to fit neatly inside of its narrative space. And there's a lot of engaging stuff. I like Gideon the Ninth overall, but I definitely found that the plot was just so bad, because the plot is that there's Gideon and there's Harrow, and Gideon and Harrow hate each other. Gideon and Harrow are from, like, they're the last two and only, like, young adults on their desolate rock that is part of the empire of, like, the great necromancer who became God, you know, 10,000 years ago. And that's just the worst quick summary of the plot setup. And so Harrow is a necromancer, and she's invited to a sort of secret competition where the winners get to be the right-hand men kind of the Emperor, some of the most important, powerful necromancers out there. And she needs to have a second person with her, so she takes Gideon, even though Gideon hates her and just wants out. And so with this sort of setup, Gideon spends, like, all of the book, like, really, really so much of the book, entirely disinterested in everything going on, which is not really a good setup, because it just means that most of the book is her wandering around the hallways and this extremely overwritten prose. The prose is, often not that good. And she's just wandering around doing nothing. She doesn't care about what's going on. And later, I think almost on a joke of how much she doesn't care, the book's plot becomes slightly about, like, who's carrying what keys, and it's just impossible to keep track of, and not fun to keep track of, and interesting. So Gideon doesn't care about this. The book barely cares about this. It's basically like winking and nodding about how stupidly convoluted its own thing is. And then by the end, it sort of comes together a lot more, and it's a bit more engaging. Again, the ideas are cool, the characters are cool, there's some fun little bits in there, but there's also just all of this really dragging... The prose writing of this goddamn house needs to be stopped. So it's just a weird book. You can really tell that the author read Homestuck and was a big name Homestuck fan. Just in terms of, like, the writing technique and the style of it, and especially the story style, where there's a lot of things that are brought up early on, and it's sort of like it's a puzzle box that's going to really heavily depend on how it finally comes together. I didn't hate Gideon the Ninth at all. I liked it overall. It's very mixed in a lot of ways. I can understand why it became really popular, but I think that there's just these really glaringly obvious flaws with it. I'm currently reading the sequel, but I have a lot of other things to do, so I don't know when I'll get through it, because it's really thick. And the sequel's radically different, and the sequel after that is radically different. So to kind of make the series even more of a mess, it seems like every book really switches it up. And a lot of people quit at the second book because of how intolerable it is. So I don't really know how I'm gonna feel about it. I totally... If I like it enough, though, I would totally dress up as Harrow for Halloween, mostly because I'm a goth and I have a lot of goth clothing, so that would work, and it seems like a fun outfit. even though she's really not my favorite character, but her aesthetic slaps so hard, right? And I think that's what works with Gideon so much, is that the aesthetic goes really hard. You have to admit that, you know? So the next book I read is Extreme Makeover Apocalypse Edition. I love this book. This is one of those books that is pretty much everything that I want in a book of its kind. I'm a big sci-fi fan. I don't write sci-fi, and I don't talk about a lot of sci-fi things. I don't even read a lot of sci-fi, but I really, really like it. I specifically like near-future tech dystopia sort of sci-fis, sort of like how Black Mirror works, but also just any near-future sci-fi where the premise is basically just a question of what if. So I really enjoy things that are just like, we take one sort of question and we follow it through to its logical conclusion. And that is what Extreme Makeover is about. It is, like, quite lacking in a lot of ways in terms of, like, all the characters kind of suck. There's not really a full character arc. There's a little bit of an exploration of one. You know, the dialogue, not that special. The prose, not that special. But I loved it because it's mostly, like, a thought experiment that's really well done and realistically done. So the premise of this book is one day a beauty company accidentally invents a lotion that is capable of imprinting to someone's DNA, and then anyone who puts it on will transform from a DNA level into that person. And it's a story of that and how in about like 200 days that causes the absolute collapse of the world. And it has this really lovely snowballing effect where it's already kind of crazy how it first happens, but it slowly gets more and more out of control until the very end where, you know, all of civilization is in tatters from this weird beauty cream. And it's just a very good exploration of, like, if the technology to completely rewrite someone's DNA was invented, how would that impact everything, you know? And the answer is really badly. It wouldn't go well. So it works very well in terms of, like, a slightly unsettling horror exploration too, because I like my DNA. I have pretty bad DNA in a lot of ways, but I like it. I'd like to keep it. And this weird world where, like, everyone's identity is being erased slowly as things get more and more dire is unsettling in that way, and I really enjoyed it. And it especially is something that I can look back on fondly because another book that I read I super hated, and is a similar kind of genre where it's just a what if, but that's in like 2 books from now, so hold on. Okay, next I read a book called If I Disappear. This is a true crime thriller kind of book. Not actually a true crime, it's a thriller from the perspective of a true crime fan. I actually do read thrillers. I used to like true crime a bit. I would never call myself like a true crime fan because that both has crazy implications and, I don't know, not really that accurate. But I used to listen to My Favorite Murder for fun sometimes, so I know the style of it very well. And If I Disappear is a book about a woman whose life is sort of gone really sideways lately, and she's become utterly obsessed with her favorite podcast, which is a true crime podcast. When the podcast host, though, stops posting anything and seems to disappear from social media, the main character becomes convinced that the podcast host has been talking to her and giving her, like, hints and prompts to tell her, you need to go find me. If I disappear, if I stop making my podcast, you know, somebody needs to find me, and it's gonna be you. I mean, she doesn't, like, full-on go delusional in terms of talking about, but she very much, a lot of the book is written with second person, where she is talking directly to the podcast host because her mental health has become so dependent on this podcast, which I can relate to. Yeah, so If I Disappear, I think that it has a lot of elements that surprise me. It's not my first time reading like a thriller kind of book, and I'm pretty used to how these go in terms of usually in the last couple chapters, they super let you down and it sucks. And in the rest of the chapters, they string you along with, you know, dramatic twists, but nothing that interesting actually happens. And If I Disappear follows that exactly. with the exception of the fact that I thought a lot of the prose and story beats earlier was sort of examining mental health in a way, and examining the idea of this character and like who can disappear, who does disappear and doesn't get noticed. Like, she feels like in her life she starts to question, as she examines like this podcast host, she starts to question if anyone would realize if she even disappeared, of like what kind of people just go missing from the world and are forgotten about, you know? That sort of stuff is kind of interesting. The problem is that the book just utterly fails in the end, as like so many thrillers do. It has an extremely stupid ending that I'm gonna kind of spoil. It's, as usual, really hard to do that quickly and efficiently. I don't want to spend too long summarizing the whole book, but I would like to just talk about the stupid ending because it really annoyed me. Okay, so at the end of the book, the main character has been living on this farm, which was the farm that the podcast host was at before she disappeared. And the farm, it turns out that there are like 13 dead bodies buried on the farm, and 2 just local guys have been accused of being serial killers, and they're locked away for the crime. And the podcast host, who wasn't dead but was in hiding, comes back, and they reclaim the family farm to be like a safe space for women. And that's fine. It's a really weak ending before the twist that's about to come. It's kind of weak. It feels kind of cheesy and sort of out of nowhere, but like, whatever. But then we go to 3 months later, and 3 months later, the wives of the 2 guys who were accused of being serial killers went to jail. They show up out of nowhere at the farm, and they confront the main character, and they say, hey, we have tons of personal accounts and knowledge that suggest podcast host is the real serial killer and our husbands were framed. And right off the bat, it's like, why have you done nothing with this information? These 2 wives have shown up in the book a number of times and at no point ever go like, actually, podcast host was like definitely the serial killer this whole time. And yeah, no, we don't have like hard evidence, but we like have so much other evidence, just so you know. But instead, they say nothing except 3 months later they show up, okay? It's really annoying. It's just this chapter where they all like stand in a parking lot and like slowly discuss theories until they solve the whole mystery. It's really bad. But then, okay, so podcast host is the murderer. Random women have revealed this. Okay, cool. The main character goes inside of like the farmhouse to go confront podcast host, and she hears a baby crying. There's a baby that lives on the farm. The baby's meant to be there. That's fine. But she hears the baby crying and she's like, oh, baby crying. Anyone here to take care of baby? She gives like a shout out. No one responds. So she goes to look for baby and take care of baby. Makes sense. She finds, though, that the baby's crying is coming from behind a locked door. This locked door is the archive room. It's where the podcast host keeps all of her like podcast research archives, okay? And the door is locked and baby is in there crying sadly. So the main character again gives like a knock and a shout. Nobody responds, so she breaks down the door to the archive room. And she finds the baby has been abandoned on the floor. And also the archive room is actually where the serial killer podcast host keeps all of her trophies. They're just lying around like just on some boxes really obviously. This is her trophy room, which confirms that she killed all of those women who were found on the farm. And also, the baby's just on the floor. It's unclear, it's never explained why the baby was just left on the floor. The only thing I can think of is that the serial killer podcast host was gonna have the baby's corpse as a trophy? Like rotting? I don't know, but there's no other explanation I can think of why the baby would be behind the locked door, just left to like die. So the main character looks at all of this crazy evidence and is like, oh no, what if podcast host is so smart that she has somehow hid the evidence or ruined the evidence so it wouldn't work in a police case? And then even if I bring this evidence forward, they wouldn't be able to convict her. So she goes downstairs and she shoots the podcast host and the book ends. It's all just so stupid. I mean, this is how a lot of thriller books like this end, but especially if I Disappear, which was like mid-tier until suddenly the end, it was just so annoyingly stupid. Okay. halfway through. I don't know. The next book I read was Angels Before Man. Angels Before Man is an angel book, which I am super into, obviously. I love angels, love those guys, love those suckers. And yeah, Angels Before Man was something that I received for free for a review from the author. But then the funny thing is that I'd bought the book a week earlier with my own money. So that was kind of a cool experience in terms of like somebody reached out to me in my inbox of like, hey, would you read this book? And I usually explain or entirely forget to explain that like I might, but I also usually have like 800 other things going on and it's hard for me to make time and my priorities might be different. But no, Angels Before Man was an angel book. I love angel books and I make extra priority for them, even though it took me months to read it. And yeah, the author reached out to me and that was pretty cool. Angels Before Man is an interesting little book. It's very unique in that there's not enough angel books that are just about angels rather than man and angels, where this is all about angels and angel society. It's angels before mankind. And that makes it instantly really unique, really cool. I really enjoyed a lot of the world building and the ideas of it. I love this vision of heaven and this vision of angels. Top tier there. The only thing is that Angels Before Man is split into 2 parts. And the first part of it is sort of a coming of age-ish, coming into identity for Lucifer. The plot is basically about Lucifer's life from first being born into heaven to falling into the first time like romantic love has ever been invented, falling into a sort of romantic love-ish relationship with Archangel Michael, which is very forbidden. And then the second half is about Lucifer's fall, mostly because, like, God is jealous of the relationship. It's a really unique idea, really cool. The writing is extremely, I'm gonna call it wet. I used this word yesterday to describe it, and I still haven't thought of a better word. So the word of choice I'm gonna use for Angels Before Man and its writing is wet. I'm gonna call it very wet writing. Very juice-covered, this writing. I like a lot of the poetry of it, but also a lot of the time it was extremely run-on, extremely repetitive, and all sort of blended together because there wasn't very good separation of like internal thoughts to vocal words to POV switches. So it all sort of meshes together into like fruit punch, you know? But yeah, the first part of the book is still really good. It's a coming of age sort of story for Lucifer finding his own identity, hanging out in this interesting heaven world that they all live in. It's lovely. It's quite sweet as well. The only thing is that it comes in 2 parts. And the first part I would recommend to tons of people in terms of being really good angel fiction. However, the second part I wouldn't recommend, and I don't like that much. And it makes reviewing the book really odd because if they were 2 separate books, I could just be like, read book 1, not book 2. But because it's in the same rather short-ish like novel, it feels like if you read the first half, you're always going to be tempted to read the second half. And I also wouldn't suggest you read the second half, really. Because the thing about Angels Before Man, second half, is that the fall of Lucifer is obviously like a tragedy story. I say that, actually, I think that's very blasphemous to say. The story of Lucifer falling from Lucifer's POV in the book Angels Before Man is a tragedy. And so it gets really dark, it gets really gruesome, there's a huge amount of like very triggering things that go on. There's a lot of like gore and crazy violence by the end. And it feels at points a little too over the top. It feels a bit gratuitous or crude. And it also, with some characters, feels like they are radically changing from how they originally were, which is slightly the point, but also means that you don't really keep with the bonds you formed from the first half very well. They feel like different people a lot of the time, especially Lucifer, and it just doesn't work that well to me. It doesn't come together properly. I just didn't like it. The writing gets a lot more like loosey-goosey as well, so the prose, which I already would often have a trouble with, became way more troublesome to parse. And yeah, I didn't like the second part that much, but I did really like the first part, and you'll have to decide what to do with that information for yourself. How about that? The next book I read was Tender is the Flesh. I hated Tender is the Flesh. It's really odd because this is a book I've seen a lot of praise for and I've seen a lot of people talk about. I've never seen direct negative discussions about it. I've seen people call it like, oh, it's really weird, it's really gross, but not like it's really bad. And it's strange to me because I think a lot of people who engage with Tender in the Flesh are just sensitive to gore. So it's extremely gratuitously over the top, gruesome, gory, bloody. It tries to gross you out like at every page. And especially in the way that it's about the meat industry. So most of the book is just walking through like a slaughterhouse step by step, and then also adding in details that don't exist in real slaughterhouses to make you even more grossed out. And I'm just not that sensitive to that sort of thing. So this is my conspiracy, is that everybody who's like, whoa, this is crazy revolutionary horror, is just a bit squeamish about butchering, and that's it, and that's fine. But I think it's blinded people to the fact that this book sucks in a lot of different ways. So Tender is the Flesh is about a world where all animal meat is unsafe to consume. All animals are just generally unsafe to be around. But the demand for meat to eat is so extreme that people pretty much immediately decide to start eating each other. And so, like, farms of human breeding for human meat farming becomes the normal thing. And it's just about, like, a guy who works for a, slaughterhouse company, and there's not really a plot. It's just a guy who works for one, hanging around, slowly living his life, and just being like, here's all the different things that people are doing with their human meat. And if it's not really obvious, this is just sort of a veganism book, and I'm not a vegan. I totally support you being a vegan, but I don't support, the moral shaming of food and the shaming of food in general. It's fine to eat meat, it's fine to not eat meat. We're all different people, and we shouldn't be enforcing one thing over the other on people, But Tender is the Flesh is very much of the opinion that meat is like an addictive evil substance, that if people don't have it for one day, they might revert into being sadistic savages who lurk outside of meat factories to eat rotten meat off the ground. That's the thing that exists in this world. It also kind of falls in with a lot of, and this is sort of maybe the worst part, conspiracy theory talk. Which is the case that the main character believes, and the narrative heavily supports the idea of the whole virus of, the virus that made animals unsafe being fake. And this conspiracy theory idea is pretty much true in this world. There's a lot of hints that suggest it likely is, and the main character certainly believes it. But the thing with this conspiracy is that it's all framed around, like, the media and universities and scientists controlling the population, with the implication that basically, like, the liberal elites are forcing people to eat meat so they'll resort into, like, savages so that we can control the population better. Like, it goes into that sort of conspiracy with it, and it's really not hard to then follow down to... Conspiracies just in general are very distasteful because pretty much all of them are ridiculous and they pretty much all lead into anti-Semitism. So it's not a very far lead to be reading this book and its sort of idea of like, the virus, this is before COVID, the virus was made up to control the population and force them to do like the wicked acts that the universities and the scientists declare, such as eating meat and turning us into savages. Like, that's just literally what Tender is the Flesh is like. And more than just the militant, ridiculous, veganism that tries to just gross you out of things by lying about how the actual meat industry works. Because the thing is that drives me crazy about this book, I'm going to do like a whole video about it, is that it tries to draw a 1-1 comparison between like, here's how we are farming humans in this future, and then the implication is that this is like one the same as how we currently farm cows. And the book just adds lots of things that are not part of a normal slaughterhouse process or cow raising process to make it more horrifying and over the top. So there's, I don't want to mention the details, and I can't because they're like really gross triggering things. Like when I do a video, I will talk about, you know, the quotes in detail, but the book just lies to you about things to try to make you more repulsed by the meat industry, all with the implication that this is what the meat industry now is like, and it's just not actually true. And that drives me crazy, because it drives me crazy, okay? So the book, really not very good. It's the counterpart here to Extreme Makeover, where it's basically asking a what-if question. And it's a question I think is a very good what-if, because exploring humanity, how we define sentience, how we define sapience, how we define humanity, and, you know, that's all really good questions. I think that, like, it's the same with Perfected, which is where I got recommended this book specifically. I think that there's plenty of good you can do writing a book about human pets, human farming like this, as in a way to explore identity and humanity and lots of other things. There's not necessarily bad ideas a lot of the time. I mean, I know that's too broad, there's plenty of bad ideas, but lots of things can be done in a way that would work, but then they just haven't been, you know, delivered in a way that would work. Okay, next book I read is The Hummingbird Killer. Hummingbird Killer is the sequel to Butterfly Assassin, and I would highly recommend it. I loved it. Butterfly Assassin is a book that I also really enjoyed. I think that I gave a mention of it in my Lightlark video, and I'm kind of pleased with that, because I hope that that means it's my video of the most views. People have picked up Butterfly Assassin because of that. I'd really like that, because it's a good series, and also I feel like I have to caveat the author is like a kind of pal of mine. But no, it's great. It is a contemporary alternate history thriller about assassins. It's specifically about a girl who is raised from childhood to be an assassin. She is an amazing assassin, but also it's an exploration of the trauma and problems that come with being an assassin, and I think that that's where it really excels, because it's not just about, like, here's a crazy cool girl and she can stab people really good. It's also an exploration of, like, her psyche in a way that I think is interesting and also kind of important, because I feel like in YA we've all become way too used to having protagonists who are just like a badass girl who stabs people, that there isn't any explanation or like exploration of actually killing, mental health, and ideas like that. The damage of violence and the effects of violence on a community or on a person. I think that, you know, those are really interesting subjects, and Hummingbird Killer, much like Butterfly Assassin, is very good at exploring that sort of thing. It still has a lot of like crazy twists and sort of thriller beats. It's almost like spy or assassin-like, you know, but then it also has a lot of things that address the character of the main character herself. I think that the book just weaves them together really well, and it can make you cry. It's a tragedy, and this is a real tragedy, let me tell you. But yeah, no, I just highly recommend it. If it sounds at all like your thing, I would please pick it up. The main character is also like confirmed Arrow Ace at this point, and also has chronic health issues, so like this is the most seen I've ever felt in a character before. This is the closest character who's anything like me, except for her whole stabby personality thing. I haven't really stabbed anyone. Next book. So the next book I read is called Uncommon Bodies. This is a short story collection that no one has ever heard of. I just sometimes pick up, you know, indie books. I pick up books that I just find randomly, and I want to read a short story collection because I like reading them. And so I picked up this entirely random book. Look at that. Uncommon Bodies fits in really well with like the semi-theme that I've picked up about identity and flesh, because it's a short story collection that is themed around identity, flesh, gore, body horror, and how those are all connected to each other. That's a really cool theme. However, a lot of the stories in the collection just don't do it for me. It's one of those things where it's very difficult to lightly sum up a collection. I have a written review of it, which I can just put in the description, where I go through each story bit by bit, individually rate them, and give, like, you know, plot summaries, including spoilers. But as a whole, talking about it, it just has that thing that a lot of short story collections do, where a couple of them are really good and I like them, a lot of them are very flat and I do not like them. But the good thing about, like, short story collections is that you only read it for like 15 pages or whatever, and then it's like, something else. You know, you can draw your conclusions. If it's good, you liked it. If it's bad, you're done with it now. So, you know, in that way it was refreshing to read about. But overall, while the author does a very good job with body horror and grossing me out, and I'm hard to gross out like that, writing some just really grotesque visions of bodies in the future and the apocalypse, it just, not all of the stories were that good. Okay, last book that I read was Small Gods. Small Gods is another Discworld book, and I liked it. It's very different from Reaperman. I would say that I liked Reaperman more, but Small Gods is still just, it has a lot of that same thing. It has a lot of good jokes. It has a lot of really profound meanings to it. It has just a lot of sheer absurdity and ridiculousness. Small Gods also is just a killer premise. Small Gods is about a very repressive, horrible religious country. And in the grand citadel of, like, the religion itself, there's a young apprentice boy, and he starts hearing a tortoise talk to him, and the tortoise is the god. It is the god of this horrible citadel. He's like the most powerful god. His name is Om, but he is in the form of a tortoise, and he has been for a while now, and the only person who can hear his voice is this one kind of simple-minded, you know, errands boy, because he is like the only person who truly believes in the god now, rather than the god as an institution. And the story is around that idea of, like, God's belief, and when we believe in people or ideas more than we believe in the God itself or the religion itself. And so in that way, it's a little bit more serious, I guess. It feels like it has a lot more of a specific thing it's trying to do, because it is a standalone book with pretty much all new characters. But it still delivers in a lot of ways. It still has a lot of funny jokes, funny gags, and really deep things, but it was definitely less my thing than Reaperman. Yeah, so those were the books that I read. I hope people don't mind my off-the-cuff kind of ramblings here. I'm doing my best. I'm standing. I have big standing energy right now. Though my coat is actually stuck on my fishnets as we've been speaking, and I'm trying with one hand to get them untangled, and it's not going well. Oh, I've done it. Okay. Okay, so, no, thank you. I have some other videos coming up, but we'll see. I've recently discovered a new trilogy that I am desperately excited to read and do a video about, though I will say that that's going to be one of those, like, let's just say it's not a well-known series anyone will have ever heard of. It's way more like The Commandment, but that's the sort of thing that I'm really into, so I'm excited. Thank you, though. Cheers.